I thought it'd be useful to talk first about what is effectiveness of an MEA. And a lot of people think it means talking about effective implementation of an MEA. But it's not that at all. It's really looking at whether the treaty is effective in achieving its objectives. And that's a completely different question than whether people are implementing the treaty. The way I explain it for Stockholm is I say, if all parties were complying with their obligations and you were still measuring POPs in the environment, then you would know there was something wrong. You may not have the right rules to control the problem because everybody's complying with the rules you have, but you still have the problem. Or it could be you don't have the right parties to the treaty. The biggest polluters might not be party to the treaty. So that's the reason. But the rules could still be sufficient. So you do have to look at what's going on and why it's happening. So it's an important distinction. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of this because I think it's quite important. So the second Montevideo Law Program, for people who don't know what this is, UNEP started, and it started, I think the first meeting was in Montevideo, Uruguay, so it's always been called the Montevideo Law Program. So this started in early 80s. It's a 10-year law program. We're in the fourth Montevideo program. So I went to this meeting in 1996. It was a midterm review of this law program. And the program is about 30 pages and lots of ambitious things to do on it. But in a given period, they can only address a few. But one of the things I saw in there that was intriguing was, okay, every treaty that is negotiated should have a provision on effectiveness evaluation. And I took that to heart, and I was just about to head into negotiating the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, and which is involving genetically modified organisms, and the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants. And POPs are chemicals that travel long range in the environment. They're toxic, they're bioaccumulative, and they're persistent. So they were considered to be the worst of the worst. And anyway, so I took this to heart, this provision, and I said, well, this is a good idea. So when I went into the Stockholm negotiations and the Cartagena negotiations, I brought that with me. And in Stockholm, I'll go into this in a bit more detail. I had a colleague who was a monitoring expert, and he was involved in monitoring environmental pollutants in Canada's Arctic. And he was concerned that the Stockholm Convention didn't have a provision like that. And I was concerned from the legal point of view as a lawyer. So anyway, but it was interesting, and I'm going to get into a little more detail about how we developed this in Stockholm. But in Cartagena, I had such a battle. Yes, we do this when we're dealing with, monitoring, pollutants, but in a procedural treaty that's dealing with GMOs, like, why would we have this effectiveness evaluation? And I was saying, well, it's the same thing. Don't you care if your treaty's working? You still care. Do you have the right rules? There's still potential. I mean, at the time, people thought there would be potential environmental impacts of GMOs. And so, to me, it was the same principle. You want to know, you're going to all this trouble to get people from all over the world to negotiate a treaty. It costs millions. People are implementing, costs millions. We want to make sure this is working if we thought the effort was worth doing in the first place. So that I found really interesting. But then when we got to negotiating the Nagoya Protocol, Article 31 there, that was painless. We just copied, everybody assumed, oh, well, we'll just have that in the Nagoya Protocol. So that was just copied right in. I didn't have to argue at all. On Minamata, that's a treaty that we finished in 2013. I was astonished, it was heavy lifting. So when we were developing the treaty in the first draft, the Secretariat had a provision in there And then as we started negotiating it, countries were arguing that, oh, we don't need the word monitoring. And so, I may be a lawyer, I'm not a biologist, but I think you need to monitor. So people were re-debating this all over again. Anyway, but luckily in the final chair's text that the chair did before the last negotiating round, he put back something very similar to the Stockholm Convention. The Basel Convention has an Article 15.7, which says it should be doing an effectiveness evaluation. And there was one very rudimentary one done in 1995. I was at a meeting, and it was a very cursory discussion, and it's never happened again. Canada tried to raise this, I think it was in 2009 at a COP, but nobody was really interested. So Basel has a strategic plan, but it's never done an effectiveness evaluation. The one that's going to be interesting is the Paris Agreement. They've set up a stock-taking provision. So that'll be one to keep your eye on if you're interested at all in climate issues. I saw a couple of people on the list had been involved in climate discussions. So I think that's going to be a very important article.